After African heads of state failed to elect a new head of the African Union Commission in July, the race finally seems to be heating up. South Africa's Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma will step down in January after just over 4 years at the helm of the continental body. But her successor will certainly have their work cut out for them. The African Union has come under criticism due to perceived slow responses to various crises on the continent. And the ongoing reform process under Rwanda's Paul Kagame is expected to shift both the organizational setup and the political nature of the continental bloc, something the new chair will have to oversee. So who then is likely to succeed Dlamini Zuma in Addis Ababa? And what challenges lie ahead for the new African Union Commission chair? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, by February next year, the African Union Commission will have a new chairperson as Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma's 4-year term comes to an end. Elections for her successor had to be postponed at the African Union Summit in July in Kigali, as none of the candidates managed the 2/3 majority required to win. But the second round of voting seems to be tighter than the first, with 5 candidates vying for the top position, as CCTV's Tuli Shabalala reports.
5 people are in the running for the top AU job. They hail from Senegal, Botswana, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya and Chad. Experts have noted the professionalism of the 5 candidates, all of whom have held senior positions in their country's governments. First up is Abdoulaye Betili from Senegal. He's an MP and until recently served as the country's environment minister. In 2014, he was appointed Special Representative for the UN Secretary-General for Central Africa. Betili is adamant that Africa cannot continue to depend on foreign aid. He is running against Pelenomi Vincent Modoy from Botswana. She's currently the Southern African nation's Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. A vocal feminist, Vincent Modoy has praised the African Union's commitment to empowering women and has pledged to continue those efforts. The next contender is Equatorial Guinea's Agapito Mba-Moki. He's the country's foreign minister, a position he's held since 2012. Throughout his career, Moki has championed Pan-Africanism and the notion of an independent and prosperous Africa. The 4th candidate is Kenya's Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary, Amina Mohamed. She's been in public service for 29 years and has held positions in multiple global agencies. If she wins, Mohamed says she plans to focus on curbing poverty in rural areas on the continent and finding sustainable ways of financing Agenda 2063. Finally, there's Chad's Foreign Minister, Moussa Faki Mahamat. A qualified lawyer, he's held the post for 8 years. Faki served as Chad's Prime Minister in the early 2000s. He's prioritized development on the continent and eradicating terror groups such as Boko Haram. The chairperson for the African Union Commission plays an important role in the organization. He or she is responsible for implementing AU decisions and shaping continental policies on trade and security. This means that come January, whoever is chosen will be responsible for mobilizing common African positions on international issues and representing Africa on the global stage. Tuli Shabalala, CCTV.
Now, East African nations have thrown their weight behind Kenya's Amina Mohamed to replace Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. As well as being the first woman to lead Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Amina Mohamed has been Kenya's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva and served as the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi. Well, I sat down with her in an exclusive interview this week to find out about her potential game plan should she be elected as the next African Union Commission chair. Madam CS, thank you very much for your time. Now, you're a candidate in the running for the African Union Commission chairperson. First, why do you want to run for that position?
First of all, clearly, we already have a roadmap. right? And that is contained in the vision, in the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. It's something that was very well prepared. It was actually in depth. The whole continent participated in crafting it, and therefore it is a document that has the consensus of the continent and which is recognized as the only blueprint that we have. And therefore my role, if I was elected, would be to faithfully but also expeditiously implement Agenda 2063, because for as long as the people at the in the villages, right, at the grassroots, do not actually feel its impact, right, then it still just remains a concept paper, right, until they feel its impact. And we can actually make that happen. We already have a 10-year, action plan, and I think we can actually have chewable bits of that implemented in real time.
In terms of those chewable little ones, what will be your priorities, though?
First of all, industrialization, right? That has to be the key. It will allow us to develop much faster than we are developing. It will create the jobs that we need. Within it, right, we need to actually diversify as fast as we can, because for a very long time we've been relying on a few primary products, right, that go to specific markets. So we need to diversify the products, but also the markets, right, so that we're able to have a much wider reach within the globe, right, and so that we as a continent, and it doesn't matter what sub-region you look at, it's the same story, it's the same picture that keeps being repeated over and over again. And the danger today is that even with the basic process of industrialization that we have begun, right, we seem to be duplicating what each other is doing. And that's really dangerous, right? We should actually be diversifying to an extent where we know that we are not duplicating what others are doing, so that we don't become not only wasteful, right, but not able to create the viable markets that we need, and the viable industrial basis that we need.
Well, Africa, though, 5 years ago talked about having a free trade area by 2017, and actually talked about Africa's intra-Africa trade as only being at 12%. I think it is still at 12%. Now, how do you accelerate that?
Now, that's I think the first priority has to be industrialization. The second one, right, has to be trade and investment coming in together, because we also know for sure that trade is one area that can actually move massive numbers of people out of poverty, right, and out of abject poverty almost at the same time. It's happened before, it's happened in Asia, and a very good example is China, right, which basically traded its way out of abject poverty and moved almost, the figures are still arguable, but it's between 350 and 600 million people out of poverty through exports, right, and exporting their products. So trade is a very, very good tool for development, and it's one that we really must embrace. How do we do that? We have to open our markets. We have to open our markets to each other. One of the biggest problems we've had on the continent is that we have a series of bottlenecks that need to be actually relegated to the dustbin. Why can't I be able to move my capital, my goods, my services, my skills, right, throughout the continent? Why is it easier for me to do that from Africa to other parts of the world, right, and not within Africa? So there are some of the bottlenecks that, we need to just create synergies. We need to harmonize policies. We need to, harmonize some of the procedures that we have in place, right? We need to have systems that actually talk to each other. We have been able to do that at that really sub-regional level within the Northern Corridor, right? We've been able to create these systems that actually talk to each other. It's much easier now to move, freight from the port of Mombasa to the hinterland, to the landlocked countries. We can do that across the continent.
What is it that you will do to elevate Africa's voice on the global landscape?
Look, I think, well, first of all, I think that there is a need for Africa to be heard much more. There's a need for Africa to be heard much more clearly, right? And but most importantly, I think there's a need for everybody else to actually understand where Africa is at today. Excuse me, it's not where it was before. It's at a different space completely. So that's one thing. But the voice of Africa, you can't even say that hasn't been heard before. It has been heard before. It's that it hasn't received attention, right? You can hear something, right, and not pay attention to it. And that's what's been happening, because actually we've had some really great advocates at the African Union Commission that have been talking for the continent, right? And so what we need to do is make others listen, right? And say, look, we're actually serious about what we're saying, right? And don't think that we're just saying it and we will not follow it up, that we're actually going to follow up, right? And that somebody will be held accountable if we're ignored.
Right. Looking down, though, 4 years down the line, if you do become chair of the AUC, what kind of an African Union Commission would you like to leave behind, or would you like to see?
One that would have implemented as much as possible the 10-year, plan of action that we have. One that will have much better capacity. One that would be very agile and very responsive. And of course, it's been responsive, but much faster responses, because some of the issues that we have faced, are issues that have, just out of the blues arisen, right? So we should be able to respond to those very, very fast. We should also be able to sustain that attention, right? So if there's a crisis that breaks out in one country, we should not just attend to it, ad hocly. We also need to have an approach that actually brings together the Agenda 2063 and the SDGs, right? The 2030 Agenda. Right? We must bring that together, so that we have to look for an approach that is much more harmonized.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we return, my expert guests will offer further analysis into the race for the African Union Commission chair. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to offer further analysis of the race for African Union Commission Chair, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg, Liesl Louw Vaudran. She's the Africa analyst and consultant at the Institute of Security Studies. And joining us from Brussels, Dr. Bello, Executive Director at Good Governance Africa. And with me in Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro. Thank you all for joining in the conversation. Liesl, I'll start off with you in Johannesburg, and very briefly to give us an overview of what you think about the contenders for the African Union Commission chair. The election has elicited quite a bit of interest there. 5 high-profile candidates here. What's your take?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is becoming really very interesting. I was there in Kigali in July when there were 3 candidates, and as many people know, none of the candidates got a 2/3 majority. The Botswanan candidate, Pelonomi Vincent Moitoi, got the most votes. She's running again, and we have, so there are 5 candidates. I must say this is almost a revolution for the African Union, because before These decisions were made almost behind closed doors. There wasn't a lot of campaigning. The only campaigning we really saw was in 2012 when Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma was running against Jean Ping, the former AU Commission chairperson. In fact, only between January 2012 and July 2012. So this is going to be so interesting. Next week, actually, at the in Addis Ababa, there's a debate, a town hall debate, as they are announcing it, that will be broadcast live with the 5 candidates.
Right.
They've been campaigning, as you say. Abdoulaye Bathily was here in South Africa this week, meeting Jacob Zuma and others as well.
Lizol, there is a lot of interest here on the continent for the 5 candidates. I just want to hear Dr. Olabella's view on that.
I think it's very important to have, you know, a professional, a rather professional process of electing candidate to the all-important position of the AU chair, as Lizzo was saying. But, you know, make no mistake about it, regardless of who's chosen to occupy this position, I think the real difficulty they're going to have to grapple with some of the, you know, institutional constraints that have historically limited the ability of the incumbent of that position to pursue agendas that are broadly transformational for the continent. And I think beyond this election season, until when we broach those important reform issues that now need to happen, I think whoever succeeds Madame Dlamini-Zuma will find themselves, you know, grappling with some of the well-known battles she's contended with over the last few years that she's been in the helm. I think on a financial level, the AU needs to reform itself.
David, I want to hear your view here.
Yeah. Certainly, there's a big agenda for whoever is next, the next chair of the commission. One, during the, you know, the most recent years, we've had, you know, the commitment to establish a continental free trade agreement. So certainly that is an important agenda. We've also had, you know, the Agenda 2063 and the conclusion of the SDG process. And so there's a lot of expectation. And so the big challenge that is often thrown to the African Union that, you know, we have very good policies drafted and well-meaning, but we haven't seen implementation. So my expectation is that, you know, there'll be a lot on the shoulders of the new chair, and certainly we'll be very keen to see what kind of approach the new chair will take in trying to resolve the challenges that have been stated, but also to implement some of these landmark decisions that have been taken in the recent past.
Lizol, in terms of the African Union Commission chair itself, though, how much dynamism and, you know, how much of the dynamism of the particular person will actually shape the agenda of the African Union? Because we've heard previously that the agenda of the African Union has already been set, Agenda 2063, for instance.
Yes, absolutely. It's an extremely difficult task, as was said before. The Agenda 2063 will probably continue, but what we've seen, and I think it is with heads of state of countries, one sees the same thing. A new person comes in and launches a project, NEPAD, the APRM, things like that. Agenda 2063, I think, will survive Dlamini-Zuma, but there are huge challenges, and we can see in the campaign documents of the various candidates, one issue that is recurrent is the independence of the African Union Commission, because it relies so heavily on funding from the EU and others that in order for the AU to really have a voice and have credibility, it must become self-funded slowly. But for that to happen, African Union member states must think that the AU is worthwhile investing in. You know, people pay their dues to the United Nations, African countries, but many of them don't pay their dues to the African Union. And there's a new plan on the table, people know about, right. I think, that was thrashed out there in Kigali to finance. So independence of the AU is extremely important. That's one of the challenges going forward.
Right, Dr. Bello?
I think, you know, beyond the important question of financing the African Union, as Liesl has mentioned, I think two other elements of reform would need to be broached. I think the most important one is probably the one that relates to the personnel that the incoming chair would have to work with. Interestingly, the 7 commissioners of the African Union Commission are not entirely accountable to the person of the chair. In fact, the chair is not wholly responsible for picking the team he or she would like to work with. This has often been settled through political horse trading, and we should expect the same dynamics to repeat themselves this time. I think it would be important to give the incoming chair, you know, that latitude to bring on board qualified, motivated personnel who can help them to take forward that vision of shaping the AU as you described it. But more importantly than that, I think they would also have to think carefully about reforming some of the key agendas on the plate for them. Security, better economic governance on the continent, and a host of other issues. I think we really now need to come up to the fore.
David, how much power does an African Union Commission chair actually wield, or is it really much of a figurehead?
Yeah, I think though in the institutionalization, of course, you want to provide a balance of powers. But you know, what the past experience has shown us is that this position indeed has a lot of influence. And so when you talk about institutionalizing some of the major establishments that have been provided, then the focus and the interest and the prioritization that the chair is able to bring on board is quite important. For instance, we know that you know, landmark decision making was made with regards to establishing a court of African justice and human rights. And so, you know, there's been debate as to whether African nations should even recommend, you know, whatever legal or justice challenges onto the ICC and the space that this new established court will take. And so if you have, you know, the AU Commission chair who has interest in this, then they can indeed, you know, ensure that that court is strong enough in order to sort of provide some intermediary or even supersede the ICC as it exists today.
Liesl, if you were to hedge your bets, though, of the 5 candidates, who do you think are the top 3 running for that position?
It is extremely difficult because there's so many issues at play in this election, and what people are saying in Addis Ababa isn't necessarily what the heads of state in a secret vote will vote ultimately, because, for example, we have regions. SADC endorsed the Minister Vincent Moitoi from Botswana. Amina Mohamed from Kenya is said to have received the support from COMESA, and COMESA overlaps with SADC. And then ECOWAS also officially supported Abdoulaye Bouteflika from Senegal. So, but then in the end there are several rounds, and as I said, it's a secret vote. There is some debate whether here in South Africa, that's a heavyweight country in the AU, will indeed support Botswana, because, you know, there is this contentious issue of the International Criminal Court. South Africa is withdrawn, Botswana supports the court. So it's extremely difficult for me to say, but I think at this point the Kenyan Minister Amina Mohamed has had a very good campaign. President Uhuru Kenyatta is going around the continent campaigning for her. Abdoulaye Bouteflika is a former UN Special Representative for Central Africa. He was a minister in Senegal. He's making a big, I think at this moment maybe those are the 2 strongest candidates. But Moussa Faki is he's the foreign minister of Chad, the other candidate. He's got a very strong president, Idriss Déby, who is he is the African Union chairperson at the moment and a strong figure on the continent. So it's not really just about the CV and the credentials of the candidate, which really, as Dr. Bello said, you need a manager actually,
Right.
somebody who's going to bring efficiency and reform. So there are so many issues at play in these elections that one is hoping the best candidate will emerge, and not that it would be sort of a compromise deal, because since the elections were postponed already for 6 months,
Dr. Bello, if
Yes.
you were to hedge your bets, though, what do you think of the 5 candidates?
I think it's left to be seen who finally emerges from the rounds of election that would progressively reduce the field of candidate. But most importantly for me, I think whoever comes in to replace Madame Zuma needs to understand the importance of the historical junction, which I think we occupy at this moment. Let's not run away from it. Our continent is one that faces a raft of challenges, probably in the way we've not previously seen. Concerns around terrorism and all of that, they've been there for quite a while. But we're also on a continent that's increasingly challenged by economic issues amidst the the depressed global commodity prices that have taken hold since 2014. This is already a huge agenda for whoever is coming in to try and lead in. But most importantly, I think the AU has an opportunity to exercise sort of thought leadership for all of Africa in terms of how we do things together in a way that's coherent, in the way that the European Union, I think, has been able to manage for the European continent, despite all of the well-known shortcomings of that integration project in our northern neighbors.
David, I want to hear your view here, because in the last election, none of the 3 candidates met the threshold. What's your take on the current candidates?
Well, it's been interesting, as has already been stated. I think the issue is that if you look at this year's process, it's certainly a bit more transparent in the sense that we are seeing candidates coming out and campaigning. And certainly, Kenya's Ambassador Amina Mohamed, I think, has been able to, her campaign has been the most visible. I think, speaking as a Kenyan and also speaking as what we see on the news. And so, but to circle back in terms of the, some of the biggest challenge that, whoever is coming in will have to handle, this issue of perception of the AU being seen as a, exclusive club of heads of state who, have immunity and basically do things as they wish and not really in the interest of the countries that they do represent. And so, as someone who's also being elected by those very same people, then it makes the work even more difficult in terms of achieving a transition, so that you have a, a perception out, you improve your perception for people to view the AU as actually being or championing the interests of Africans.
Right, and we leave it there for the moment. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Liesl Low-Vodran, she's the Africa analyst and consultant at the Institute of Security Studies. In Brussels, Dr. Bello, Executive Director at Good Governance Africa. And with me in Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. Goodbye.